My name's James. I'm interested in bringing methods from empirical psychology, cognitive sciences to bear upon philosophical questions. The question I'm interested in today is, what are colours, in fact? So there's this really important case in the philosophy of colour which helps you decide into which of two broad categories of philosophies of colour you sort of ascribe to. And that's a disagreement case, cases where people appear to disagree about the colour of the object. The way this helps you decide is because if what you think about this case puts you into one of two broad categories. So if you think that both parties can be right about the colour of the object, in some sense something can be green relative to one person, not green relative to another, that puts you broadly in a relationalist camp. And if you think that, no, damn it, the object is either green or not green, right, it's got to be one of them, then one of the folks is wrong, that puts you broadly within an anti-relationalist camp. Right, so the way in which you sort out traditionally in the philosophy of colour which two of these two broad camps of view is the best one is sat around in your armchair. You're interested in thinking carefully about things, working through the logical consequences of each type of view, and just thinking about things carefully. And I don't think that's a bad way to do it, it's just that I want to supplement the philosophy of colour by looking at some kind of empirical evidence. So I'm what we call an experimental philosopher. And what experimental philosophers are, this is going much slower than I thought it was going to. We use empirical tools from the cognitive sciences to probe how ordinary people think about philosophically interesting things such as colours. And as I say, it's not to say we don't think thinking about things carefully is a bad way, is a good way to do philosophy. It's just. So why should philosophers of colour care about what ordinary people think? Well, it just seems that they do, right? There's this kind of principle underlying what's going on that to go against what ordinary experience tells us about the nature of these properties would be, without a good reason at least, would be a mistake. And so this question, how do ordinary people think about colours, is really important in the philosophy of colour, but they've tended to assume that they can answer it from the armchair. Philosophers are ordinary people too, is the thought. So the basic empirical approach that we were using is to present people with these disagreement cases and see whether they think both parties can be right. And we were interested in comparing what they thought about such cases in the case of colour with what they thought about such cases in the case of shape, something about which we suspected ordinary people were going to think was very objective. Right. This person thinks it's a triangle, this person doesn't think it's a triangle, can they both be right? Being the thought. Now there's an interesting complication with this method, and that is just because someone tells you, oh yeah, no, I think they can both be right, doesn't mean that they're denying that the properties are in some sense objective, right? So people might be saying it simply because they say, well, I don't know which of them is right, so yeah, sure, they're both right in some sense, but that doesn't mean they're denying the property is objective. Likewise, if they think, well, yeah, they can both be right in a sense, they both might be accurately reporting how the object appears to them, right? Again, that doesn't come with a denial that the property itself is objective. Again, they might be saying they think it's just, they can both be right in the sense they mean something different by the word red or green, I think, as I had it in the case, doesn't mean they're denying that that property is objective. So in order to avoid that sort of complicating factor, we introduced participants to a bunch of disambiguating statements to begin with, right? So asked them to sign up for whether they agree, disagree with a bunch of disambiguating things before we asked them the question we were interested in, that is, in reality, is there an absolute fact of the matter about the colour of the object regardless of what these folks think, say, or do? And what did our results look like? Well, it turns out that people are pretty damn objective about both colour and shape. So hopefully we're going to get a graph in a moment, right? So when we ask non-philosophers, this is the top half. This is the top half of the scale, so you see it goes from 5 to 10. People are very objective about both. In particular, they are no less objective about colours than they are shape. Interestingly, we included a bunch of philosophers in our sample as well, and there's a massive difference in the philosophers. Philosophers are way more objective about shape than they are colour, and that's super interesting. One of the reasons it's super interesting is because it goes against the findings of a previous study which didn't deal with these complicating factors, which showed that non-philosophers looked a lot more like the philosophers looked in our sample. They found that people were way less objective about colour than they were about shape. Now, what do I take from this? What I take from this is, if you're interested in how ordinary people think about things as a philosopher, then you need to be doing some empirical work as well, right? That's a really important thing to be doing. But because, as you see, philosophers thinking about how ordinary things seem to them seem to come up with some very different answers than ordinary people, right? So armchairs aren't always good enough for thinking about that kind of thing. But you've got to be careful what questions you ask, right? So, as I noted, this previous study, which didn't deal with all the complicating factors that we dealt with, showed people they didn't get the right answer, right? So you've got to be careful how you ask the questions. Now, there's very interesting questions remaining out of this research, and that is why we're seeing this massive difference between what philosophers think and what ordinary people think about colours. And if you've got any interesting ideas about that, you should come find me at the end.